Now, Beaver Scouts as young as 6 years old are being quizzed about their gender identity by Scout chiefs when completing the annual census for the organisation. In the census, the 112-year-old youth organisation members are being asked to define their gender, not their sex. So they're given options which include male, female, or I self-identify, or of course, I prefer not to say. Well, joining us now is Kellie-Jay Keen, founder of Standing for Women, a women's rights activist and frequent guest on GBNews, of course. And I believe, actually, the last time we met, it was three of us, and I think it's got quite interesting. We had a robust discussion.
We had a very robust discussion.
Thank you.
Which is what this channel's all about, yes, differing views.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us again. I mean, when I first looked at this, I thought, oh gosh, not again. What's all this about? But then, you know, the option is I prefer not to say, or I self-identify. It's hardly, you know, the most harmful thing for children, is it? Or do you disagree?
Well, I think we have to remember when we talk about transitioning, trans and different gender identities, that the optimum goal for somebody who believes in this, who believes that their gender, whatever that is, it's never very well described. Whatever that means is not in direct correlation with their biological sex. So the ultimate goal would be to take hormones, puberty blockers, and have transition surgery. Now, that is not an ideology I think we ought to be introducing to children. I don't think that is something that 6-year-olds can possibly understand. And there is no final bit where you actually do become a person of the opposite sex with a fully functioning body that is the same as whatever it is that you are trying to target. So I think it's really dangerous. And I just wonder what on earth they think they're doing and who this is for, because it's not for the 6-year-olds that they're asking.
Well, I mean, I certainly know my 6-year-old, who's actually 7 in a couple of weeks. I mean, I'll tell her from you, Tom. I certainly know she has absolutely no concept of this thing that is gender identity at all. So I do agree with you in terms of it's very early on to even be introducing children as young as 6 to those kinds of concepts. But do you agree? I mean, the Scouts do say that, look, we're trying to be inclusive. This is just a census that we conduct every year of our members. And some people might want to, you know, say that they self-identify. So we're just being inclusive.
I don't really understand what inclusion has anything to do with gender identity of a 6-year-old. The fact that they can't define what gender identity or gender is, and we just rely upon identifying as, and then we use words woman and man, which apparently some people, even on this show, don't know what quite those words mean. And so I think it's just absolutely bonkers that we are trying to introduce an ideology which is ultimately very harmful for human bodies. Being a lifelong medical patient is not something we should encourage any child to be, which is what it is if you start introducing the concept of being born in the wrong body.
Are we at risk here of making a mountain out of a molehill? The Scouts is an organisation that has a survey that it conducts every year that goes to every member of that organisation. Now, understandable, you want to focus on the 6-year-olds, but this is a survey that is given to every member. And sure, you might make an argument there that it shouldn't be given to the very youngest, but ultimately, they're just asking people what their gender is.
Yeah, well, they don't really know what their gender is, do they? Because gender is an ethereal concept that not many people can possibly define. Gender, apparently, is something that is linked to your biological sex and the expectations and the stereotypes based upon a person on the basis of their biological sex. So it all leads back to biology. And so this idea that you have a separate bit of your body that is not linked to your actual physical body is something that belongs in religion alone.
So your criticism here isn't necessarily that this is about 6-year-olds who are just a small proportion of those who will be taking the survey, which is for all members of the organisation. Your criticism is it would be the same of any organisation. If an organisation of pensioners asked for gender rather than sex, you'd have the same criticisms to make.
Well, I think possibly there is an argument with adults to try and find out just how far this nonsensical ideology has reached. But the dogmatic religious element of transgenderism and transgender ideology is that there is no place that you can't enter. There is no person that you can't try to bring into believing in this ideology. And at the moment, it stretches to 6-year-olds. In fact, I have emails from people who say the woman of the I can't remember who it is, the health visitor will ask you to ask your 3-year-old, are you a boy or a girl? So it's very wide reaching. The Scouts are failing in their duty to safeguard children from things that I feel are very harmful.
Are people really going to read that much into a checkbox on a survey that goes to all members of an organisation? I wonder.
Well, if they're not going to read into it, why bother having it in the first place? If there's nothing to read into, if it's not trying to achieve something, why do it?
I do want to ask you, because me and Tom certainly have completely different views, I would say, on this. We have perfectly civil conversations all the time about it, to be honest. I'm personally more in line with your way of thinking, but I do want to ask you, how can we, if we can at all, bridge divides between what is becoming an increasingly polarised conversation, and the people on both sides seem to be constantly disagreeing, sometimes even turning to vitriol to make their points. Can we ever bridge this divide that there is between people on this issue in particular?
Well, this is the issue. There are women who have fought very hard for our rights, and there are those that seek to take it. Now, I don't believe that women should have to be particularly polite in defending those rights. There are also people that have worked very hard to safeguard children, and there are those people that would like to obliterate the safeguarding. And I don't think we should be particularly polite when defending the bodies and minds and health of our children. So is there a gap to be bridged when when men are trying to grab the rights of women? And when I bet my bottom dollar it's predominantly men driving for these changes in the Scouts, or when that's happening, I just don't see why it shouldn't be heated. Women are perfectly entitled to be very, very angry about this notion that people don't really understand what a woman is, or people don't really understand why women want privacy and dignity in changing rooms and spaces where they might be in a state of undress. So unless the gap can be bridged by people backing off of trying to steal women's rights, I don't really see how it can be calm waters.
So you don't believe that trans women exist, or that anyone can transition, or that transgender people are valid in that way. Do you believe that trans men exist, that there can be trans men?
I don't believe that anyone can possibly change sex. I think people might want to achieve the appearance and try and live, what on earth that means, live as the opposite sex. But I don't really believe we can transition. If you look at the rates of failure in surgeries that so-called trans men have, so women who want to be seen as men, if you look at the catastrophic, devastating, life-limiting complications from surgery, I don't think any right-minded person would ever advocate such a thing. We cannot start talking about people losing the ability to use their perfectly healthy human bodies by having surgeries that render them not quite as useful as they used to be. That's ridiculous.
K. Rowling would say that people can be transgender, but you disagree with her there.
Well, I think transgender is an umbrella term for quite a wide range of things. That might be somebody who calls themselves non-binary, who's a 14-year-old girl and quite confused. Maybe she's on the autistic spectrum. Maybe she's a lesbian. Or it could be a man at age 54, happily married with kids and grandkids, who suddenly decides he'd like to dress as a woman. So it's such a broad term. My view is very, very clear. The thing I'm most interested in is the safeguarding of children's bodies and the safeguarding of women's spaces and dignity and rights. Beyond that, it's not really any of my business what anybody else wants to call themselves or do. And I think in a compassionate and tolerant society, we would enable people to do that, whatever their motivations for doing it. But I just don't want those men in women's spaces, and I don't want anybody to start introducing this dangerous ideology to children.
Well, Kellie-Jay Keen, thank you so much for joining us again and giving us your insights there, founder for Standing for Women, a women's rights activist as well. Do join us again another time. I'm sure that won't be the last we discussed of that issue. We do have to say, of course, the Scouts did give a statement in the Mail online. They said, every year Scouts take a census of membership. This information is vital for supporting members. The census asks for the same questions, no matter your age, gender, identity, refers to an individual's internal knowledge of their own gender, knowing you're a man, woman, boy, girl, or none of these. So that's what they said.
I think that's reasonable. If it's a question that it's the same form that's given to Scout leaders or 18-year-olds, and yes, OK, the organisation goes down to 6-year-olds. I think it's probably less than generous that we only talk about how this is about asking 6-year-olds their gender. It's not really.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I understand the point she's making. There is often a slippery slope to these things. But I mean, I can't pretend that I'm particularly offended that this question is on this census necessarily. It doesn't make me roll my eyes, but, you know, then I kind of crack on with my life. I'm not going to sit around. But there are certainly legitimate concerns around this. And, you know, I think it's important to always discuss them in a civil way.
Think discussions are the way that we bring light to an issue, usually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed.